Section 13 of the Golden Web by Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 13. An Informal Tea Party. After all, the element of unconventionality was absent from Deane's tea party. About 4 o'clock, looking landwards from a little sandy knoll just in front of his strange abode, he saw two figures coming along the dyke path. A few minutes later, Ruby Sinclair and her companion came across the last little strip of shingle and approached the spot where Deane was waiting for them. "My uncle would like to make your acquaintance, Mr. Deane," she said. Deane held out his hand and welcomed his visitor, a small, fussy-looking little man with a gray mustache and a somewhat awkward air of being at his ease. He wore a tweed knickerbocker suit, very old-fashioned and of local make, a flannel collar, and an ill-chosen tie. He shook hands with his host in a perfunctory sort of manner. "Thought I must just look you up," he exclaimed. "Living out here? Such a lonely spot, too. You are going to play golf, of course?" Deane shook his head. "I never play," he answered. "I have come here to rest." To rest? The word seemed a strange one to the fussy little man, who was already taking stock of his surroundings. Photographs in silver frames, a pile of books, all new, a gun and a fishing rod, and other such belongings, all naturally the best of their sort. "Well, but you must do something," Mr. Sarsby remarked. "You cannot sit here all day and look at the sea, like the fishermen," he continued, with a little laugh. "A very lazy lot are fishermen," he went on. "Never go out if there's a ripple on the sea." Deane nodded. "The tides," he remarked, "are rather treacherous, I should think." The servant brought in tea and a great dish of strawberries, at which Mr. Sarsby gazed in amazement. "Strawberries!" he exclaimed. "Why, we don't begin to think about them for another 6 weeks." "Is that so?" answered Deane carelessly. "I never know anything about seasons, and my man is doing the catering. Miss Sinclair, you must make the tea for us. I'm afraid our methods are a little crude, but you see we are trying to get along without any women servants." Mr. Sarsby was a little abashed. He had seldom sat down to a table covered by a cloth of such fine linen, and he had certainly never been waited upon of late years by a manservant. His little eyes roved inquisitively around. "You come from London, sir, my niece tells me," he remarked. "From London," Deane replied. "A wonderful place," Mr. Sarsby said with a sigh. "Since I retired, unfortunately, I have had to drop out of life altogether." "Your health?" Deane suggested politely. "My health and my ridiculously small pension," Mr. Sarsby answered. "I can't make out what the country is coming to. Years ago pensions were altogether on a different scale. Today it seems to me that every government is always trying to shirk its obligations to those who go out and help to build up the empire." This was Mr. Sarsby's famous little speech, which he made regularly several times a week in the village, and once a year at a club dinner. Deane received it in sympathetic silence. "Tell me how you spend your time, Miss Sinclair," he asked. "You play golf, I think you told me." "Oh, I do all the obvious things one has to do, living in such a place," she said. "I swim, I fish, I play golf and tennis when I can get any. I sail a boat when I can borrow one. Those things are all sport to you, I suppose. When they become not part of your life, but the whole of it, they are a dreary sort of pursuits." "My niece is seldom satisfied," Mr. Sarsby said sharply. "Why should I be?" she asked. "You, at least, have had your day. You have seen something of life, in however small a circle. I haven't. I dare say after 20 years away I might be content with these things. Life for you is simply a satisfactory thing or not, according to whether you have beaten Colonel Forsitt or whether he has beaten you, whether you are heeling your mashie shots or laying them dead, holding your putts or leaving them short. You see, I haven't quite come to the stage where I find these things sufficient." "At any rate," Mr. Sarsby remarked, with what he imagined was a dignified air, "there is no need to take a stranger into your confidence. Mr. Deane is scarcely interested." "On the contrary," Deane answered, with a little bow. "But I thought you told me, Miss Sinclair, that you were probably leaving us before long." "Oh, I hope so," she replied. "My uncle was not a man to break his promise, and he did promise. I'm expecting to hear now every day." After tea they wandered out on to the little stretch of sandy shingle which alone separated the cottage from the sea. The girl had walked on a little ahead, and Deane laid his hand for a moment upon her uncle's shoulder. "Mr. Sarsby," he said, "did I understand that the name of your niece's uncle was Sinclair, the same as her own?" Mr. Sarsby nodded. "Yes, sir," he said. "Richard Sinclair. He was her father's brother, you see. A queer, wandering sort of fish. However, he certainly did write the girl a few weeks ago, saying that he was back in England and hoped to realize a large sum of money on some of his investments, and promised to send for her to come up to town. Since then we have heard nothing from him." "Do you read the papers, Mr. Sarsby?" Deane asked. "I read the Times for an hour every afternoon between 5 and 6," Mr. Sarsby admitted. "I have a special arrangement with Mr. Foulds, the vicar, which enables me to do this a special arrangement," he concluded with a little gurgle of satisfaction. "Our vicar, by the by, Mr. Deane, is a highly intelligent man. He will doubtless be coming across to see you." "I am here for so short a time," Deane said. "It is very kind of people, but really it is scarcely worth their while to trouble to come to see me. I am going on to Scotland in a few days. It is only that I was a little run down and scarcely felt up to a large house party that I came here first." "You are one of those fortunate people, I see," Mr. Sarsby remarked, a little envious, "who mix in the world." Deane shrugged his shoulders. "More or less, I suppose," he admitted. "But I was asking you whether you read the papers. I did so for an object." "I wonder whether you have noticed the details of a very sordid murder that was committed in a London hotel a short time ago?" "I never read of such things, sir," Mr. Sarsby declared. "They do not interest me. I read the political news and the foreign intelligence. Anything that pertains to India, also, naturally claims my attention. I have always contended," he continued, "that a golf column in the Times, say twice a week, would be much appreciated. We who study the game from the scientific point of view would like to see the attitude the Times would take on certain matters. For instance, I myself—" "Pardon my interrupting you, Mr. Sarsby," Deane said, with his eyes upon the returning figure of the girl, "but I was speaking about this murder. Curiously enough, the unfortunate man was named Sinclair, and he had just returned from abroad." Mr. Sarsby slowly opened his mouth, looking up at his companion blankly. "You don't for a moment imagine," he began, "that there could be any connection between this person and Ruby's uncle?" "I haven't any idea," Deane answered, "but when she mentioned his name and told me that he had just come back from Africa, and that she had been waiting for a letter which did not come, it certainly occurred to me to be rather in the nature of a coincidence." "Have you a paper?" Mr. Sarsby asked hurriedly. Deane shook his head. "No," he said, "but there must be a village library, or some place where the London papers are preserved." "There is," Mr. Sarsby declared. "I will hurry back. I will go and read about it at once. Does it say whether the unfortunate man," he continued, "was possessed of any means?" "I do not remember," Deane said. "The object of the murder was supposedly to be robbery, but the hotel he was staying at scarcely seemed to be one likely to attract a man of wealth." "I shall hurry back at once," Mr. Sarsby declared. "If there is anything in this, I must come and ask your advice." "If the thing seems in any way possible," Deane remarked, "you will have to run up to town and make inquiries." Mr. Sarsby opened his mouth. "My dear sir!" he exclaimed. "Go to London? But there," he added, "I forgot. If there is anything in it, the estate would of course pay my railway fare. Such a busy week, too, as I have next week," he added, taking out his memorandum book and glancing at it for a moment. "I have 7 golf matches, 3 foursomes and 4 singles. I scarcely see how I could get away. Ruby," he called, "come along, my dear. We must be getting back." The girl stifled a yawn. She was beginning to be a bit curious as to why their host had devoted all his attention to her uncle. "Very well," she answered laconically. "I am quite ready. Good bye, Mr. Deane." "If I may," he said, "I will walk a little way with you." They crossed a strip of shingly beach together. Afterwards, by necessity, the party became detached. Mr. Sarsby walked on ahead. Deane and the girl followed him, a few yards behind. "You seem to have found plenty to say to my uncle," she remarked curiously. "If you will spoil an interesting tea party," he murmured, "by bringing in an elderly male relative." "It wasn't my fault," she interrupted. "He would come, insisted upon it, as soon as he knew that I had spoken to you. Your man has been making purchases and sending telegrams in the village, which has made every one curious. People who live in small places are always such snobs." He laughed. "Well, I had to talk to your uncle anyhow," he said. She nodded. "You know now what I have to put up with," she said. "He is a dull, ignorant, pompous little bore. You have probably found that out for yourself by now." "You dismiss your relatives a little summarily," he remarked. "I try to speak the truth," she answered. "I believe in being just to people. If I knew of any good quality that he possessed, I would tell it to you, but I don't." She believed in being just. He looked at her as she walked by his side, stepping along with the delightful freedom of healthy youth, her limbs clearly defined beneath her thin skirt, for they were facing a land breeze which played havoc also with her hair. She walked well, her head a little thrown back. Deane recognized the graceful lines of her neck and throat, the carriage of her chin. There was something particularly rhythmic about her movements. She was a believer in justice. Well, she looked like that. The mouth, in repose, was a little hard, the jaw determined. He found himself wondering, with a nervous sort of morbid curiosity, exactly what she would say and do if she had known with whom she was walking, and if Dick Sinclair had indeed been her uncle. Supposing she knew the whole truth, knew of that heated interview, knew of Rowan's enterprise, knew of the paper which was still sewn into the dead man's coat. She would scarcely be an easy person to deal with, he thought. Her uncle had turned around. They had reached the end of the dyke. A little grass-grown footpath led them now to the side of the harbor, beyond which lay the village. "Mr. Deane," he said, "Mr. Deane, I should like to show you the village schoolroom." Deane nodded. "I should be very glad," he said. Mr. Sarsby turned to his niece. "Ruby," he said, "go home and tell your aunt where we are. I shall be home in half an hour, perhaps 25 minutes. If there is any message for me from the golf club, the boy can wait till I return. This way, Mr. Deane, this way." The girl turned away with a little grimace and waved her hand to Deane as she disappeared. The two men climbed the village street side by side. End of section 13.